At 4:47 a.m. on November 19th, 1942, Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann presses back against the frozen wall of a ruined apartment building in Stalingrad, listening to the sound that had killed 11 men in his company over the past 6 days. It wasn't the roar of Soviet tanks. It wasn't the scream of Katyusha rockets. It was silence, complete, suffocating silence that meant a Soviet sniper was hunting. Hoffmann was 28 years old, a veteran of the French campaign, an experienced infantry sergeant who'd survived 16 months on the Eastern Front. But in the past week, something had changed in Stalingrad. German officers were dying, not in assaults, not in bombardments. Single shots, one bullet, always fatal, always from impossible distances. The weapon responsible was a rifle that cost less than a German soldier's boots. A design from 1891, a mass-produced bolt-action that Soviet factory workers assembled for $12 worth of materials. The Mosin-Nagant M91/30. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, if you're finding value in these untold chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Whether you're in Berlin, Boston, or anywhere in between, your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Hoffmann heard it again, the crack of a rifle shot echoing through the frozen streets. Then screaming, German screaming. Lieutenant Weber was down, third officer this week. The sniper had hit Weber in the throat from an estimated 600 meters. One shot. Weber died in 40 seconds, drowning in his own blood while his men pressed field dressings against a wound that couldn't be stopped. Hoffmann pulled his company back into the building. 14 men, exhausted, freezing, terrified. Not of Soviet infantry, not of tanks, of a rifle they couldn't see and a shooter they couldn't find. The Mosin-Nagant wasn't supposed to be a weapon that changed battles. It was old when World War II started. The basic design dated 1891, created by Russian captain Sergei Mosin and Belgian designer Mosin-Nagant. It fired a 7.62 by 54 millimeters rim cartridge at a muzzle velocity of 2,625 feet per second. The rifle weighed 8.8 pounds unloaded. It held 5 rounds in an internal magazine. It had an effective range of 500 meters with iron sights, 800 meters with the PE or PU sniper scopes added in the 1930s. By 1942 standards, it was obsolete. German soldiers carried the Mauser Kar 98K, a more refined weapon with better machining and tighter tolerances. American troops would soon be equipped with the semi-automatic M1 Garand. The British had the Lee Enfield. The Mosin-Nagant was crude by comparison. Soviet factory workers produced them with minimal machining. The stocks were rough-cut hardwood, often left unfinished. The metal parts showed tool marks. The bolt action was stiff and required significant force to operate. The rifle kicked like a mule when fired. It was heavy. It was uncomfortable. It cost almost nothing to manufacture. And in the hands of properly trained Soviet snipers, it became the most cost-effective killing machine on the Eastern Front. The story of how the Mosin-Nagant became a terror weapon starts not in Stalingrad, but in Finland 2 years earlier. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. The Red Army expected an easy victory. Finland had a population of 3.7 million, compared to the Soviet Union's 170 million. The Red Army outnumbered Finnish forces 3-1 in troops, 30-1 in aircraft, 100-1 in tanks. Soviet commanders anticipated the war would last 2 weeks. It lasted 105 days. Finnish forces inflicted catastrophic casualties on Soviet troops. One reason was the terrain. Dense forests, deep snow, temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet tanks and artillery struggled in conditions where Finnish ski troops moved freely. But the primary reason was Finnish marksmanship. Finland had a deep hunting tradition. Most Finnish men grew up shooting. They understood ballistics, windage, elevation adjustments. When the Winter War began, Finland mobilized citizen soldiers who could make 400-meter shots with iron sights as casually as Soviet conscripts could fire a rifle in the general direction of an enemy. The Finns used Mosin-Nagants. Finland had purchased thousands of M91 rifles from Russia before the 1917 revolution. When the Soviets invaded, Finnish troops used Soviet-designed weapons against Soviet soldiers with devastating effectiveness. The most famous was Simo Häyhä, the White Death. Häyhä was a farmer from Rotjärvi. He stood 5 feet 3 inches tall. He used an unmodified Mosin-Nagant M91 with iron sights. Between November 1939 and March 1940, he recorded 505 confirmed sniper kills, all with the Mosin-Nagant. He operated in temperatures below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, in snow, in conditions where most rifles would freeze or malfunction. The Mosin-Nagant kept functioning. Soviet casualties in the Winter War exceeded 120,000 dead. Finnish casualties were approximately 25,000. The kill ratio humiliated Soviet military leadership. When Stalin's generals analyzed the defeat, one factor stood out: the effectiveness of trained marksmen with basic rifles. The lesson was clear. You didn't need expensive weapons. You didn't need complex technology. You needed shooters who could make first-round hits at distance, and you needed weapons that functioned in the worst possible conditions. The Mosin-Nagant was that weapon. In April 1940, Soviet military command established formal sniper training programs. The schools drew heavily on lessons from Finland. Instructors taught camouflage, stalking, range estimation, wind reading, and most importantly, patience. A Soviet sniper wasn't taught to fire rapidly. They were taught to fire once. One shot, one kill. Students trained with Mosin-Nagant rifles fitted with either P. Pritzl-Exportny scopes or the later PU, Pritzl-Unitarny scopes. The PU scope offered 3.5x magnification, mounted on a side rail that kept the sight low and close to the bore. The scope wasn't high-tech. The optics were basic, but they were durable and they worked in extreme cold. By June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army had trained approximately 2,000 dedicated snipers. That number would grow to over 50,000 by 1945. The vast majority used Mosin-Nagant rifles. The weapon's reliability in extreme conditions made it ideal for the Eastern Front. The bolt action was simple. Fewer moving parts meant fewer failures. The 7.62 by 54 millimeters cartridge had excellent long-range performance. The heavy bullet retained energy at distance better than the German 7.92 by 57 millimeters Mauser round. The rifle's weight, which made it uncomfortable for infantry use, actually helped snipers. More weight meant less felt recoil and faster target reacquisition. The straight bolt handle, often criticized for being awkward, allowed shooters to work the action without removing the rifle from their shoulder. Everything about the Mosin-Nagant that made it seem outdated actually made it perfect for sniping. Soviet military doctrine embraced sniper warfare in ways Western armies didn't. While American and British forces treated snipers as specialists operating independently, Soviet forces integrated snipers directly into infantry tactics. Every Soviet rifle company had a sniper section. Their mission wasn't just to kill enemy soldiers. It was psychological warfare. Target officers, target radio operators, target forward observers, target anyone whose death would disrupt command and control, make the enemy afraid to stand up, make them afraid to give orders, make them waste time on suppression fire against targets they couldn't see. The Mosin-Nagant's cost effectiveness meant the Soviets could arm snipers at scales Western armies couldn't match. A Mosin-Nagant with PU scope cost approximately $30 to produce in 1942. A German Kar 98K with ZF-41 scope cost closer to $80. The Americans' M1C sniper rifle, introduced in 1944, cost over $100. Soviet factories produced Mosin-Nagants at rates exceeding 2 million rifles per year. Izhevsk Arsenal and Tula Arsenal, the primary manufacturers, operated 24-hour production lines. Quality control was minimal. Rifles that would have been rejected by German or American standards were issued to Soviet troops. But they worked. That was all that mattered. By late 1942, German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to fear Soviet snipers. The fear wasn't irrational. It was based on statistics. German Army Group Center reported that 35% of officer casualties between October and December 1942 resulted from sniper fire. In urban combat zones like Stalingrad, that number reached 47%. Soviet snipers weren't just killing soldiers. They were targeting leadership. Sergeant Hoffman experienced this firsthand. His company had entered Stalingrad with 3 officers and 157 men in September 1942. By mid-November, all 3 officers were dead, 2 from sniper fire. The company had been reduced to 43 men. They held a sector consisting of 4 ruined buildings and approximately 200 meters of rubble-strewn street. Soviet forces held the buildings across the street. The distance between positions varied from 40 to 150 meters. 2 closed for artillery, 2 exposed for assaults. Both sides had settled into a deadly stalemate where snipers ruled. Hoffman knew the Soviet sniper was somewhere in the 3-story apartment building 180 meters to the east. The building's facade was partially collapsed, creating hundreds of firing positions. Windows, holes in walls, gaps in floors. Any of them could conceal a shooter. German return fire had been useless. They'd fired thousands of rounds at suspected positions. Hit nothing. The sniper kept killing. On November 20th, Hoffman's company received reinforcements. 32 men and a new officer, Lieutenant Richter. Richter was 22 years old, fresh from officer school, no combat experience. Hoffman briefed him on the tactical situation, emphasized the sniper threat, explained that officers in this sector survive an average of 4 days. Richter dismissed the warning. Soviet snipers were propaganda, he said. Exaggerated stories to explain German incompetence. Good field craft would keep him safe. Richter lasted 11 hours. At 6:23 a.m. on November 21st, he made the mistake of standing fully upright in a 3rd-floor window to observe Soviet positions through binoculars. The shot came from 200 meters. Hoffman heard the rifles crack, saw Richter's head snap back. The lieutenant fell backward, dead before he hit the floor. The bullet had entered his left eye and exited through the back of his skull. Hoffman examined the body. The wound pattern indicated a downward angle. The shooter had been elevated, probably in a top-floor position. That narrowed the possible firing locations to approximately 20 windows in the Soviet-held building. But which one? Hoffman had been an amateur hunter before the war. He understood shooting. He knew that the sniper had fired immediately when Richter presented a target. No hesitation. That suggested experience. It also suggested the sniper had pre-ranged multiple positions and was simply waiting for German soldiers to appear in them. This wasn't random shooting. This was calculated. That evening, Hoffman gathered 8 men and explained a plan. They would create a false target, use a helmet on a stick, the oldest trick, raise in a window where Richter had been shot, wait for the Soviet sniper to fire at it, track the muzzle flash, return fire immediately. 3 men with rifles would be positioned to shoot at any location where they saw a flash. It was basic counter-sniper tactics. It should work. They raised the helmet at 7:15 a.m. on November 22nd. Nothing happened. Hoffman waited. 5 minutes. 10. Still nothing. The Soviet sniper wasn't falling for obvious tricks. Hoffman tried again at 8:30 a.m. This time he had a soldier move the helmet slowly, as if someone was scanning the Soviet positions. Nothing. The sniper waited. At 11:40 a.m., Corporal Becker got careless. He stood up to adjust his position, silhouetted briefly against a window. The shot came instantly. Becker took the round in the chest. The 7.62 by 54 millimeters bullet punched through his ribcage, destroyed his right lung, and lodged in his spine. He died in 4 minutes. Hoffman now understood. The Soviet sniper wasn't reactive, wasn't impulsive, didn't shoot at decoys, only shot at confirmed human targets, and hit them with first-round accuracy. The shooter Hoffman was facing might have been any of several dozen highly skilled Soviet snipers operating in Stalingrad during November 1942. One of the most effective was a woman. Senior Sergeant Ludmila Pavlichenko had been assigned to the 25th Rifle Division defending Odessa in 1941. She was 24 years old, a history student at Kiev University before the war. She joined a sniper school because Soviet women were being recruited for combat roles due to catastrophic manpower losses. Pavlichenko qualified as an expert marksman and was issued a Mosin-Nagant M91/30 with a PE scope. In her first combat engagement, she killed 2 Romanian soldiers supporting the German advance. Over the next 2 months defending Odessa, she recorded 187 confirmed kills. When Odessa was evacuated, Pavlichenko's unit was transferred to Sevastopol. She continued sniper operations through the siege of Sevastopol, raising her confirmed kill count to 309. In June 1942, she was wounded by mortar fragments and evacuated to Moscow. Soviet propaganda officials recognized her value. She became the face of Soviet sniper operations, touring the United States and Canada in late 1942 to promote the Soviet war effort. But Pavlichenko was just one of approximately 2,000 Soviet female snipers who served during the war. Women like Rosa Shanina, who recorded 59 confirmed kills, Nina Lakovskaya with 89 kills, Luba Makarova, 84 kills. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of a systematic Soviet program to utilize every available resource, including female soldiers, in ways that maximize combat effectiveness while minimizing cost. The Mosin-Nagant made this possible. The rifle required strength to operate, but not excessive strength. Women could handle the recoil. They could work the bolt action. They could carry the weapon through long stalking approaches. Soviet training emphasized patience and discipline, attributes that many female snipers demonstrated in abundance. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Wehrmacht troops had been conditioned to view Soviet forces as inferior. The idea that Soviet women were killing German officers challenged German soldiers' sense of superiority. It was demoralizing in ways that male snipers weren't. Back in Stalingrad, Hoffman's situation was deteriorating. His company was down to 38 men. They received no supplies in 4 days. Ammunition was running low. Food consisted of whatever they could scavenge from ruined buildings. Water came from melted snow. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were developing frostbite, and the Soviet sniper kept hunting. On November 24th, the sniper killed Private Zimmerman, shot through the neck at 140 meters, while Zimmerman was moving between buildings. Zimmerman bled out in 6 minutes. On November 26th, the sniper wounded Corporal Fisher, shot through the shoulder at an estimated 200 meters. Fisher survived but was evacuated. The company was now down to 36 men. Hoffman realized something had to change. They couldn't survive indefinitely with a sniper controlling their sector. German doctrine called for artillery suppression of sniper positions, but artillery support was non-existent. The 6th Army was surrounded at Stalingrad. Every artillery piece was committed to defensive positions. No guns were available for counter-sniper work. Hoffman would have to solve this problem with the resources he had. On November 27th, a German supply drop landed 400 meters from Hoffman's position. The drop contained ammunition, medical supplies, and 1 crate labeled optical equipment. Hoffman opened the crate. Inside was a Zeiss Zilvier 4X rifle scope and mounting hardware for a Kar 98K. The scope had been intended for a sniper team that no longer existed. Hoffman had no training as a sniper. He'd hunted deer before the war. He understood basic marksmanship, but he'd never engaged human targets at ranges exceeding 100 meters. He'd never trained in stalking, camouflage, or counter-sniper tactics. But he'd been watching the Soviet sniper for 8 days. He'd seen where the shots came from. He'd noted the patterns. The Soviet shooter operated from the top 2 floors of the apartment building, probably moved between positions, fired from different windows to avoid being targeted, never shot more than twice from the same location. The shooter waited for confirmed targets and fired single shots. No follow-up rounds. No suppressive fire. Just 1 shot, then silence. Hoffman knew that to kill this sniper, he'd have to think like the sniper. He'd have to predict where the shooter would appear next and be ready when it happened. He spent November 28 preparing. He mounted the Zeiss scope on his Kar 98K. The scope added 1.2 pounds to the rifle's weight. He zeroed it at 200 meters using a rubble pile as a backstop. The scope's optics were excellent, far better than the Soviet PU scopes. He could clearly see details at 300 meters that were blurry with iron sights. He selected a firing position in a second-floor room with 2 windows. One window faced directly toward the Soviet-held building. The other faced at a 45-degree angle. Both offered clear fields of fire. Hoffman set up his position carefully. He moved rubble to create a stable rest for the rifle. He positioned himself back from the window, deep in shadows. He draped a blanket over his shoulders to break up his outline. Basic fieldcraft. Nothing sophisticated, but sufficient to make him harder to spot. On November 29th at 6:10 a.m., Hoffman settled into position and began watching the Soviet building through a scope. The waiting was harder than he'd anticipated. Sniping wasn't action. It was patience. Hoffman scanned each window methodically, left to right, top floor, second floor, back to the top. His eyes ached from staring through the scope. His shoulders cramped from holding position. Hours passed. Nothing moved in the Soviet building. No muzzle flashes. No shadows. No indication that anyone was there. At 9:40 a.m., Hoffman's concentration wavered. He'd been motionless for 3 hours and 30 minutes. His legs were numb. His back hurt. He considered taking a break, standing up, stretching. Then he saw movement. Third floor. Window on the left side. A slight shift in shadows. Something had moved behind the window frame. Hoffman focused on that window. Saw nothing more. Waited. 2 minutes. 5. At 9:47 a.m., a figure appeared briefly in the window. Hoffman saw a face. Young. Male. The figure was scanning the German positions. Hoffman placed his crosshairs center mass. The range was approximately 190 meters. No wind. The figure moved back from the window. Disappeared. Hoffman kept his scope trained on that position. Waited. At 10:03 a.m., the figure reappeared. This time closer to the window. Hoffman could see the shooter clearly now. Soviet soldier, holding a Mosin-Nagant with a scope. The sniper was looking toward Hoffman's company positions, scanning for targets. Hoffman controlled his breathing, exhaled slowly. The crosshairs settled on the Soviet sniper's chest. Hoffman had perhaps 2 seconds before the sniper moved again. He squeezed the trigger. The Kar 98K fired. The recoil pushed him back slightly. Through the scope, Hoffman saw the Soviet sniper jerk backward and fall. The shot had hit. Hoffman worked his bolt, chambered a fresh round, kept the scope on the window. No movement. The Soviet sniper didn't reappear. Hoffman waited 30 minutes. Still no movement. He'd either killed the sniper or driven him away from that position. Over the next 3 days, no German soldiers in Hoffman's sector were killed by sniper fire. The Soviet shooter either died from Hoffman's shot or was rotated out of the sector. Hoffman never confirmed which. But the killing stopped. The psychological effect on Hoffman's company was immediate. Men moved more freely. Officers gave orders without fear of instant death. Morale improved. The constant terror that had gripped the company for 2 weeks lifted. One shot had changed everything. But this wasn't the end of the Mosin-Nagant's impact on the war. It was barely the beginning. By 1943, Soviet sniper operations had evolved into a systematic program unlike anything seen in modern warfare. The Red Army established dedicated sniper schools that graduated thousands of trained marksmen annually. Training lasted 3 months. Students learned ballistics, camouflage, stalking, observation, and most critically, psychological discipline. Soviet doctrine emphasized that a sniper's primary weapon wasn't a rifle. It was patience, the ability to wait for hours or days for a single perfect shot. The Mosin-Nagant's reliability made extended operations possible. A sniper could remain in position for 48 hours with minimal maintenance required for their weapon. The rifle functioned in rain, snow, mud, extreme cold. German weapons were more refined but more sensitive to environmental conditions. The Mauser required regular cleaning to maintain accuracy. The Mosin-Nagant could go weeks without cleaning and still deliver acceptable accuracy. Soviet snipers developed tactics that maximized the Mosin-Nagant's capabilities while minimizing exposure to return fire. They operated in pairs, with a spotter and shooter. The spotter used binoculars or a spotting scope to identify targets and calculate range. The shooter remained motionless until the shot. After firing, both snipers would immediately relocate. Never shoot twice from the same position. Never establish a pattern. Never become predictable. These tactics frustrated German counter-sniper efforts. German forces responded by establishing their own sniper programs, but they couldn't match Soviet production scales. Germany produced approximately 130,000 sniper variant Kar 98K rifles during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 330,000 sniper variant Mosin-Nagants. The numerical advantage meant Soviet snipers could saturate sectors in ways German snipers couldn't. In some battles, Soviet forces deployed snipers at ratios of 1 per platoon. German forces averaged 1 sniper per battalion. The effectiveness was measurable. Soviet military records indicate that sniper units achieved kill ratios averaging 1.5 rounds expended per casualty inflicted. Standard infantry units averaged over 3,000 rounds per casualty. The cost effectiveness was staggering. A single Soviet sniper with a $30 rifle could inflict casualties that required thousands of dollars in ammunition to achieve through conventional fire. The psychological impact multiplied the physical casualties. German soldiers learned to fear areas where Soviet snipers operated. They moved cautiously, avoided exposing themselves, wasted time on suppression fire against suspected positions. Unit effectiveness declined even when snipers weren't actively shooting. The most famous Soviet sniper was Vasily Zaitsev. Zaitsev was born in the Ural Mountains in 1915. He grew up hunting wolves and deer with his grandfather. Before the war, he worked as a clerk in the Soviet Navy. When Germany invaded, Zaitsev volunteered for frontline service and was assigned to the 1047th Rifle Regiment defending Stalingrad. He received a Mosin-Nagant M91/30 with a 3.5x PU scope and began sniper operations in September 1942. Between September 22nd and November 10th, 1942, Zaitsev recorded 225 confirmed kills. His tactics emphasized patience and psychological warfare. He would identify German positions, memorize the daily routines of enemy soldiers, and predict when targets would appear. Then he would wait, sometimes for hours. When a target appeared, Zaitsev would fire once. The target would fall. Zaitsev would relocate immediately. German forces in his sector became paralyzed with fear. Soldiers refused to move during daylight. Officers gave orders from cover. Radio operators dismantled their antennas to avoid being identified as high-value targets. Zaitsev's effectiveness drew attention from German command. In early November 1942, Wehrmacht leadership sent Heinz Thorvald, an experienced German sniper, to Stalingrad with orders to eliminate Zaitsev. Whether Thorvald actually existed has been debated by historians. Soviet propaganda may have invented or embellished the story, but the tactical duel between snipers was real. German records confirm multiple experienced snipers were deployed to Stalingrad specifically to counter Soviet sniper operations. According to Soviet accounts, Zaitsev spent 4 days hunting Thorvald. He studied German-controlled sectors, identified likely sniper positions, and observed patterns. On the 4th day, Zaitsev noticed a glint of reflected light from a sheet of corrugated metal in a German position. The glint appeared briefly, then disappeared. Random debris wouldn't move. Someone had shifted position behind that metal. Zaitsev waited. For 6 hours, he watched that position without moving. His Mosin-Nagant rested on a stable support. His crosshairs never left that piece of metal. At 4:17 p.m., the metal shifted again. A helmet appeared. Then a head. Zaitsev fired. The figure fell. Zaitsev claimed it was Thorvald. German records don't confirm Thorvald's death, but German sniper was killed in that sector on that date. Whether it was Thorvald is uncertain. What's certain is that German sniper activity in Zaitsev's sector dropped significantly after November 1942. The psychological victory was more important than the individual kill. Zaitsev's story became Soviet propaganda gold. He was promoted to officer rank and toured Soviet positions teaching sniper tactics. By war's end, the confirmed kill count reached 242, all with a Mosin-Nagant rifle. The Mosin-Nagant's effectiveness wasn't limited to snipers. Standard infantry versions of the rifle served Soviet forces throughout the war. Over 17 million Mosin-Nagants were produced between 1891 and 1945. During World War II alone, Soviet factories manufactured approximately 10 million rifles. Production peaked in 1943 at over 2.5 million rifles annually. The weapons equipped Soviet infantry divisions that bore the brunt of fighting against Wehrmacht forces from 1941 to 1945. The rifle's reliability in extreme conditions made it ideal for the Eastern Front. Temperatures range from minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit in winter to 95 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Battlefields included forests, steppes, swamps, mountains, and urban ruins. The Mosin-Nagant functioned in all environments. German soldiers captured Mosin-Nagants regularly and used them when ammunition was available. The rifle's simplicity made it easy to operate even for soldiers unfamiliar with Soviet weapons. Finnish forces continued using captured Mosin-Nagants throughout the Continuation War, 1941 to 1944. Finnish troops considered the rifle superior to their own weapons for winter warfare. After World War II, the Mosin-Nagant remained in service with Soviet forces until the mid-1960s, when it was gradually replaced by the SKS and AK-47. But the rifle didn't disappear. It was exported to Soviet client states worldwide, used in conflicts across Asia, Africa, the Middle East. The rifle's durability meant weapons produced in 1943 were still functioning in combat zones in the 21st century. In 1991, military historians estimated that Mosin-Nagant rifles have been used in more armed conflicts than any other rifle design in history. The weapon appeared in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Hungarian Revolution, Afghan-Soviet War, Yugoslav Wars, Syrian Civil War, and dozens of other conflicts. A rifle designed in 1891 was still killing people 120 years later. The cost-effectiveness that made it effective in 1942 made it attractive to militaries with limited budgets for decades afterward. In the 21st century, Mosin-Nagant rifles are still in use by militia forces in conflict zones. The rifles are also popular among civilian shooters in countries where surplus military weapons are legal. In the United States, surplus Mosin-Nagants imported from former Soviet states sold for as little as $79 in the 2000s. Collectors and shooters discovered what Soviet soldiers knew in 1942. The rifle was crude, heavy, uncomfortable, and completely reliable. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann survived Stalingrad. His company was evacuated before the 6th Army's surrender in February 1943. He was reassigned to Army Group Center and fought in defensive operations through 1943 and 1944. In July 1944, Soviet forces overran his position near Minsk. Hoffmann was captured and spent 3 years in a Soviet POW camp. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947, weighing 98 pounds, suffering from tuberculosis and malnutrition. He recovered slowly, returned to his home in Bavaria, married in 1949, and worked as machinist for 32 years. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say he'd been a soldier, nothing more. In 1989, a German historian researching Stalingrad found Hoffmann's name in Wehrmacht records and contacted him for an interview. Hoffmann was 75 years old. The historian asked about his experiences as a counter-sniper. Hoffmann said he'd fired one shot that killed one Soviet soldier. That shot may have saved a dozen German lives in his company. But he calculated once that Soviet snipers in Stalingrad killed approximately 10,000 German soldiers during the battle. His one shot meant nothing in that context. The historian asked if Hoffmann felt the Soviet sniper program had been effective. Hoffmann said effectiveness wasn't the right word. Soviet snipers hadn't just killed German soldiers. They created a climate of fear that made every German soldier less effective. Officers hesitated to lead. Radio operators feared using their equipment. Forward observers avoided exposed positions. The cumulative impact was impossible to quantify. One rifle that cost $12 to produce had psychological effects worth more than a tank. The historian Aswad Hoffman remembered most about facing Soviet snipers. Hoffman said the silence, that moment after a shot when everyone froze, waiting to see if they were next. The realization that death could come from anywhere at any time, from an enemy you'd never see. That silence was worse than artillery, worse than air raids, because it was personal. A sniper chose you specifically. Klaus Hoffman died in 2003 at age 89. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an infantry sergeant. It did not mention his counter-sniper work, did not mention the Soviet shooter he'd killed, did not mention the terror that Soviet snipers inflicted on German forces. He was buried in a cemetery in Bavaria. At his funeral, his grandson found a photograph in Hoffman's effects. A young sergeant in Wehrmacht uniform standing in rubble. The date written on the back was November 1942, Stalingrad. Nothing else. That's how weapons change wars. Not through technological superiority, through psychology, through cost-effectiveness, through the systematic exploitation of simple tools used by trained people who understand their craft. The Mosin-Nagant was never the best rifle, but in Soviet hands, used according to Soviet doctrine, it became one of the most effective weapons of World War II. The rifle cost $12 to produce. Training a sniper cost approximately $500. Together, that $512 investment generated an average of 50 to 100 enemy casualties per trained sniper. No weapon system in World War II offered better return on investment. German counter-sniper programs tried to replicate Soviet success, but couldn't match the scale. The Wehrmacht sniper training was superior in some technical aspects, but Germany couldn't produce snipers at Soviet rates. Manufacturing limitations, resource constraints, and doctrinal differences meant German sniper forces remained small elite units rather than integrated components of infantry tactics. American forces encountered similar challenges. The U.S. military established sniper programs late in the war, but American doctrine emphasized firepower over precision. American infantry tactics relied on suppressive fire and combined arms coordination. The role of individual marksmen was diminished in a system designed around squad automatic weapons and artillery support. The British had a stronger sniping tradition, particularly in Commonwealth forces. Canadian and Australian snipers achieved notable success in both world wars. But British forces never matched Soviet production scales or tactical integration. The Mosin-Nagant's legacy extends beyond World War II. The rifle demonstrated that effectiveness in war doesn't require cutting-edge technology. It requires understanding your operational environment, training your personnel appropriately, and employing weapons that match your doctrine. Soviet forces understood this. They built a system around an old, cheap, reliable rifle. They trained people to use it effectively. They integrated snipers into tactics that multiplied their impact. The result was a weapon system that killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers and created psychological effects that degraded enemy effectiveness across entire fronts. Modern militaries still study Soviet sniper tactics from World War II. The emphasis on patience, camouflage, target selection, and immediate relocation remains relevant. The basic principles haven't changed. What has changed is technology. Modern sniper rifles offer capabilities the Mosin-Nagant couldn't match. Ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. First-round hit probability above 90%. Advanced optics and ballistic computers. But the fundamental mission remains the same. Eliminate high-value targets, disrupt enemy command and control, create psychological pressure that degrades combat effectiveness. The Mosin-Nagant proved that mission could be accomplished with a rifle that costs less than a pair of boots. In 2024, collectors and historians continue to study the Mosin-Nagant's role in World War II. Museums across Russia, Germany, Finland, and the United States display examples of the rifle. Some show evidence of battlefield use, where on stocks replacement parts kill marks carved by soldiers. Military historians debate the rifle's actual effectiveness. Soviet kill counts were likely inflated by propaganda. Not every claimed sniper kill was confirmed. Some casualties attributed to snipers probably resulted from other causes. But even accounting for exaggeration, the statistical impact is clear. Soviet sniper forces achieved results disproportionate to their numbers. A relatively small number of trained marksmen armed with basic rifles inflicted casualties, consumed enemy resources, and created psychological effects that shaped how battles were fought. The German response to Soviet snipers validates their effectiveness. Wehrmacht forces dedicated significant resources to counter sniper operations. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Our community spans from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. We'll see you in the next one.